Now, we've all interacted with Peter over the course of the day, but I want to introduce you properly as a speaker. Now, obviously a great collaborator in putting together this conference, for which many thanks. But just to introduce you briefly to Peter and his career, he's Editor-in-Chief of Fine Art Connoisseur, the bi-monthly magazine that serves collectors of historical and contemporary representational painting, sculpture, drawings and prints. And he's also president of Projects of 19th Century Art, the firm he established to pursue a range of research, writing and curating opportunities. Many of you will know his work as a curator, of course. We've experienced that, but also to mention the exhibition of Waterhouse that he co-curated with Liz Pratt-John and Robert Upstone, which was at the Groningen Museum in the Netherlands, the Royal Academy in London, and the Montreal Museum of Fine Arts in 2013. Peter is also a pioneer in digital art histories, as well as material ones, and was the co-founder with Petra Chu of 19th Century Art Worldwide, an online peer-reviewed journal, which is sponsored by the historians of 19th century art. And I know many people in the room will be indebted to that journal for the work it's done in disseminating new research about the 19th century in an open access way. And so, in the spirit of that, I shall hand over to Peter.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, Sarah. And just to repeat how grateful we are to Sarah in particular, but obviously everyone at the Paul Mellon Center for your hospitality. Can I be heard? I'm short. I better move this. Okay. So it's late in the day, so I promise to be very speedy. This is really a short talk to rather pave the way for tomorrow. Tomorrow is going to be another amazing day, albeit at a different location. You've already heard from Ian about where we're going tomorrow at 9 o'clock, and I'm looking forward to it enormously. It's a situation where the whole day devoted to film, preceded by, incidentally, a very important paper by David Mayer on theater, is precipitated by a discussion that we had in 2013-14 with our colleagues at the Frieze Museum. Liz and I were very keen on the studio houses and the way that space was affected in the paintings vis-a-vis the houses themselves, all of that interconnection that we've been discussing today. But our colleagues at the Frieze Museum were also interested in the influence of Tadema's paintings on filmmakers. And that was deeply interesting to us too, because it ties in directly with that fascination with space and how it's managed. And so, brilliantly, Frank van der Velde and Marlies Stoder brought in Ivo Blom from the Vrije Universiteit in Amsterdam. I think he's here in the back row. We adore you. We could not have done any of the filmic anything without Ivo. So that really made the project sing, because it took it forward into the 20th century and beyond into our own time. And so what I'd like to do then is just raise a few issues related to these interconnections of visual culture very briefly, so that we have these in mind tomorrow. There are many smarter people than me speaking tomorrow about theater and film, but I wanted to at least set it up a bit. The title of the talk is helpful in the sense that it shows that linkage between the galleries where Alma-Tadema exhibited, and by the way, I'm talking about Lawrence only here. I must be frank. We have to focus on Lawrence and not think about his amazing family just now. The idea of Printsellers, people selling reproductive engravings and etchings of his paintings, moving on then to theaters, for which he designed, and then finally to the cinemas that I just mentioned, which are the specialty of Ivo and his colleagues. The idea of transmitting Alma-Tadema's imagery for a 20-year period between the mid-1890s and just before World War I. The statement that I've kind of come back to again and again is this, which I'll read very briefly. Throughout his career, Tadema sought to transport his audiences to the past, to recreate the experience of moving through historical spaces by activating his meticulous archaeological research and flair for compelling compositions. He made the past real to modern viewers in his paintings, in the reproductive engravings and etchings he made after them, and also in the sets, costumes, and props that he made for theater productions. This widely accessible imagery was much appreciated by early filmmakers who shared Tadema's passion for telling a good story and enhancing the tale's immediacy through visual immersion. And I want to stress this idea of widely accessible. I'm not focused on the luxury product of the painting right now. I'm thinking about the image. which is something that will excite and infect people across the world in this period that we're reviewing, the 1890s and 1900s. Now, let me jump back a bit just to say that, of course, the print replication, reproduction industry was up and running in the mid-19th century, and Tadema, therefore, was born at just the right time. I'm showing you here simply one example of an earlier painting, 1870, now in Hamburg, and here is the steel engraving on paper after it in the collection of the Frieze Museum. Sorry about the awful slide, but you get the idea. Basically, it's the same image, and this engraving is going out across the world. Please notice that there's a 4-year gap between the exhibition of the painting and the distribution of that engraving. It took a long time for a brilliant printmaker like Blanchard, a Frenchman, to make this engraving. He's doing it for Gambard. Now, the expert on this subject, alas, is not with us today. He's Robert Verhout, who wrote an intervention in our book. His book, Art in Reproduction, is phenomenal, and I highly recommend it. He is living in the Netherlands, working there. Now, I'll just touch briefly on the idea of the dealers with whom Tadema is working to distribute not only paintings but also prints. Now, we've talked a bit about Gambard already, and I'm sure Jan could tell us much more about his fellow Belgian, but it seems to me that that entrepreneur was absolutely crucial in getting the Alma-Tadema printmaking industry up and running, and his successor firm took it forward after Gambard retired. The idea that, according to Robert, a total of 72 paintings were commissioned by Gambard, and at least 19 were reproduced. Now, this is a slow process where one has to track all of these images, and Robert has done just that, and I encourage you to look at his book if you have the time. This also pertains then to Goupil, and paintings were commissioned as well by Tooth and Agnew in London. Now, the print selling business was especially well attended to by Agnews. They were really good at it, and William Agnew in particular was very vociferous about the printmaking business and how profitable it was. I've got another terrible slide from the Frieze Museum. I should have contacted Marlies for better ones, but this is a later work, as you can see. Again, please notice the 3-year gap between the exhibition of the painting and the distribution of the print. I'm showing you this one because it's hand-colored. And my point here is that we've got a whole range of options for the consumer. This is a mass audience. Tens of thousands of prints are made in certain cases. So you can choose black and white or hand-colored. You can have different kinds of paper. You can have it signed by the engraver, by Alma-Tadema himself, or not at all. I'm telling you, surely, much of what you already know, but I think it's important to underscore the sheer range of possibilities and therefore the enormity of the audience receiving these works on paper. It's a middle-class audience of staggering scale, and even if you don't buy that print, your brother or sister bought it and has it in their home hanging in a frame, and they're very proud of it, and you see it and admire it and say, ooh, that's lovely. So, boom, Alma-Tadema is present in your life even if you're not an owner. Now, we've already heard from a previous talk about the fact that Tadema became chairman of the British Copyright Law Committee. Thank you, Caroline. This was a big deal because he and his colleagues knew there were enormous amounts of money to be made or lost if this system got hijacked by pirates, and that's why it was watched so very carefully. That's a whole separate chapter of Robert's book, and it's absolutely fascinating. Now, we are big fans of this man. I won't bore you with the fabulous story of this being discovered on Antiques Roadshow by Rupert Moss, but we're thrilled to have the actual painting in the show, all 3 venues. I show it here, of course, in a different context. This is an artisan, a printmaker, Leopold Lowenstamm, a Dutchman. He's a friend of Tadema, ultimately. He makes at least 17 prints after Tadema's work. As you know from the exhibition here, he is busy making an etching after one of those courting couple pictures. And it is one of the most marvelous images of an artisan at work. And indeed, this was a close relationship because, as you probably know, this picture was dedicated to the wife of the sitter. That was Alice Search, the nanny who appears in the Ashmolean picture over the mantel that we've all been raving about for the last day and a half. Now, the fact is, here is a painting that Lowenstamm copied. I don't have an image of the print, but I'm sure you can imagine this image in black and white. But hold your horses. This is where Tadema's temper gets a little out of control, and Caroline was certainly on the right track here. He writes to his friend Lowenstamm as follows: I cannot feel completely satisfied with the progress of the plate as submitted to me in the last proof. You pay no attention to the modeling on the photo. You accept very little of my comments. You reproach me for having failed in keeping my promise. You are childish and infatuated with your work as to tell me that under the circumstances you doubt very much whether any etcher could do better. I am sorry to have to write, Lowen, that I decline to sign such works as it stands, and I trust that our meeting tomorrow at 12 noon will make you feel that it will be a good thing if you took up the plates again and worked at it with all the might and wish to make it as well as you can. Ouch. I have a feeling, I don't think Leopold slept that night. It seems to me that this is where it gets real, because specifically, Tadema knew the stakes were high. Money to be made, but also what an audience he was in front of. And here I show the marvelous painting that Philadelphia kindly loaned to us for the first venue in Holland. There is that print in the home of Frank Lloyd Wright. We're not messing around here. These are not just middle-class people, bourgeois. It's a whole wide world of people gathering these. And we, Liz and I, think it's completely fascinating that someone as advanced as Wright is collecting a picture like this and putting it in his own home. And that's probably room for another paper or essay, because it really is interesting to imagine that Wright is respecting a genius in the use of space. That's what this is about, that he sees that this man knows how to manage light and shade and space. Bingo, that's the calling card for young Wright. Now, transferring now from that world of an audience out there that loves the imagery of Tadema to good old Tadema himself. He was a lot of fun. I mean, that cannot be denied, even if he had the temper. We've seen this image already of him dressed up, having fun at the many costume parties that he attended and hosted. This one's more fun, in fact. Burne-Jones having a little bit of a giggle at the expense of short, tubby Tadema. But the idea of loving to dress up is absolutely crystal clear in this family. It's not just Lawrence, it's the whole family having fun, and we have proof of that in terms of Laura thanking costumers in the theater business for sending her samples to wear. Now, I would like to focus on this obsession, this fascination with theatricality in terms of the paintings and then in terms of life in the house of the Alma-Tadema family. I think the phrase mise en scène is absolutely right here, placing on stage the arrangement of everything that appears in the framing, the actors, the lighting, the decor, the props, the costumes, and so much more. He is himself a theater director in his mind every time he goes to work on the easel. Here I go right back to the 1860s, where we have a poet reading his poems to a queen in her convent. You know, it's theatrical, it's performance, right? I mean, this is one artist performing for a listener and her friend. Here we go on in the 1860s to people arriving for the theater. Obviously, Tadema was smitten by the Odeon in Pompeii and wanted to bring it alive with theater goers, just as his friends in Paris and Brussels were bringing alive the theater-going activities of modern people. Well, the curtain itself is a device that he uses constantly in much of his art. That is a theatrical tool. He uses it in his home, the portiere curtains that are draped all over the place, but also here as a strategy for making us giggle. This young man is very definitely not Salve down here, and that's just fine. So it seems to me we have to go right back into Tadema's early life. I'm so pleased that we heard a talk today from Stephanie about the obsessive recording of things that he saw in museum collections and elsewhere. Here we have him drawing medieval clothing and illuminated manuscripts. We have a few of these in the checklist of the exhibition. This is very important stuff that just by nature, he is busy looking at costume all the time. I would argue he had a shoe fetish. There are so many shoes in these collections that Stephanie described, and I think that's really interesting because here's the thing. Any theater person will tell you when you're watching a historical performance, the devil is in the details, and the details are the shoes. If the shoes are not right, everything else falls apart. And I think Tadema knew that. I think he realized that every little thing had to be just right. Now, here he is in London, living from 1870 onward, and he's in a milieu of theatrical glory days. There is so much theater going on in London and England at that time. something like 300 troops performing in different levels of quality across southern England. And here is an example of a home production. I think there's a whole separate lecture, surely, about the idea of aristocrats or wealthy families putting on productions either in the original Greek or in translation to impress each other. This is the culture of Leighton as well, and Poynter and Moore and so on. And I'm just showing you a few examples from the 1880s. These productions are widely noticed, of course, and they are informed by the meticulous archaeology of the era, and including Alma-Tadema, among others. He certainly is not the only one interested in exactly what was being excavated and so on. Now, in 1893, which is the beginning of my little moment here, he says to a journalist, "To a man of my temperament, there are particular inducements to stage work. You see, in a picture, you can only take a single phase of your subject, and there is an end of it. But on the stage, you have your subject in the concrete, so to speak. There is life, movement, reality. And then, too, there is the charm of having to create an illusion, an impression of reality, and that, after all, is a very real object of art of any kind." Bingo. That's exactly it. He wants to bring everything to life from the past. The good luck for him is that he's living in the era of romantic pictorialism in the theater. The great champion of that is one of them anyway, Henry Irving. I think we all know about him. His partner in crime, Ellen Terry, who in fact was a dear friend of Laurence, the daughter, as we heard earlier today, a dear friend of the family in general, and also H.B. Tree. The idea that these were hugely talented people, full of energy, actor-managers who were running their own businesses and, of course, reanimating the past in their performances and productions. Well, we'll hear from David Mayer tomorrow in great depth about this incredible career that Tadema conducted all through the 1880s, 90s, and early 1900s, bringing to life the ancient past, or even the medieval past, or the Renaissance past, on the stages of London and elsewhere in England. I'm showing you here only one example from Hypatia, a new play based on an old story, and this is it just cracks me up every time I look at it, because this is basically a performance in Alma-Tadema studio. This is Casa Tadema. I don't even need to say it, but I will. You see a stage. You see a rounded dome. You see the Mexican onyx windows with the classical metalwork in front. You see a patterned floor. By the way, you see a staircase leading up. All of it is just so wonderfully Alma-Tadema. So what he's basically doing is bringing his home studio atmosphere to the stage in the West End of London, and it's a huge hit. One thing we haven't talked about today, and I'm sorry about that, is this amazing series of drawings made by a Dutch artist on a visit to the Tadema household in 1891 and published in a Dutch periodical. But this is a terrific image in the exhibition that absolutely, you could toggle back and forth all day long, just making that connection. And of course, the audience loved it because they knew the house already through illustrations in the periodicals anyway. I'm interested in the fact that Tadema, playing with his mechanical toys, as Caroline described, was also building cool things for the theater productions. Here he is designing a chest into which Henry Irving can hop in and out without hurting himself. I mean, this is a really mechanical-minded guy. He's basically an engineer at heart. And the fact that he goes to this length when no other fancy artist might is very impressive indeed. In 1898, he's involved in Tree's production of Julius Caesar. It's a triumph of sorts. And here we go with a line drawing of one of the sets. It's pure Alma-Tadema, obviously, and of course it makes perfect sense in the context of Julius Caesar. Even the cartabulum table at the bottom left, it's just absolutely ripped out of one of the paintings. And there we see the actual set of that production from a program booklet with Tree exerting himself right in the middle. And here we go, a little closer look. I'm showing you this costume not because I'm so interested in what Tree looks like, but because coming back to Tadema and his obsession with clothing, look at this. This is a line drawing from the Daily Mail. Tadema would hop out of the audience, run backstage, and dress the actors more properly. He was very aware that Tree was anxious about whether he got the toga on properly and how heavy it might be, because these were the real togas. These were not just little evocations of them. These were actual authentic clothes. And so the actors would take lessons from Tadema, and indeed he would work closely with them throughout the run of the show to make sure that it was all right. We have in the exhibition, I'm glad to say, some very generous loans from the V&A. Very few of these plans, these designs survive because they're considered ephemeral in general. This is from their production of Coriolanus that was mounted by Irving in 1901, much delayed, I might add. They're exquisite drawings, and they're used by the costumers to make up the outfits. This is a group of drawings of props. Of course, all of this material has vanished, and that's what's so heartbreaking, that, of course, there are a few things left in the Theater Museum, but really not much. This magnificent watercolor of the set for Coriolanus is pure Alma-Tadema, and there it is. I think we need to understand how impressed the audiences were. They gasped in wonder as the curtain raised, and there was this Alma-Tadema painting come to life. With people populating it, moving about. It must have been everything he dreamed of. What I find amazing is, when did this man sleep? I mean, he's busy running a painting career, and he's also making these fabulous productions. The idea here in the Coriolanus drawing that you see on the screen is not so much the architecture at the center, but it's that roof line to the left. Do you recognize that? We've seen this slide about 400 times today. I think it's fantastic that his own house is involved in this particular production, and many people in the audience would have known it. I think we cannot bypass tableau vivant, the idea that, of course, many people were entertaining themselves at home with these reanimations of the past, or obviously animate and then don't animate, in this case, an aristocratic scene. But this is very present in the lives of the theater goers to whom Tadema's productions are being presented. And so I think that is always in the background, and I think tableau vivant studies are certainly coming along really well. This reproduction, again from the Frieze Museum collection, is actually from a newspaper. It is not a reproductive print that you would buy. It's in the paper itself. And I think it's important to stress this as, again, more exposure for the artist, that he is so catnip, if you will, to the journalists, to the editors of the periodicals that he's thrown in there, along with the reviews of his exhibitions and such. So this is super familiar imagery through the newspapers as well as through the commercial market. I've stolen from Ivo, who has a rich collection of reproductive postcards, this one because it's in Russian. I mean, this image got around, obviously, as far as Russia, and I love the fact that this is 1910. This is very late in the career, and yet still he's being looked at by people who may never see the actual painting in the flesh. We're delighted to have this wonderful picture in the show anyway. All of this material really should not be discussed without tipping the hat to Lynn Need. She wrote one of the definitive books on the subject, 2007. I just show you the cover here, and I'm absolutely not qualified to talk about this transition into film as she is, and certainly not as much as Ivo, David Mayer, and so on. But I think this is really a wonderful area, and we need to connect Tadema tightly to it, and indeed that's what this project has done. Ivo went and burrowed away at the Eye Film Museum in Amsterdam and found fantastic matchings where the painting lines up beautifully with the film. He'll be able to talk about that tomorrow, but I show you just one example here from the exhibition that you've already seen. And for our Australian friends, of course, we have to always remember that fabulous picture that you've got in Sydney. This was the picture that enchanted Ridley Scott so much that he had to have the actual scene in his film, even though it wasn't directly connected to the plot. The idea of daily life, of life on the streets of crowded multicultural Rome. There it is. We've got the painting at left, we've got the reproductive print at right, and we've got Ridley Scott in 2000. The most famous example recently of a filmmaker in the thrall of Tadema is indeed Sir Ridley Scott with Gladiator. You know he got lots of credit for that success. Here I'm badgering a very wonderful man called Arthur Max, who lives in Los Angeles and London, and he is the Oscar-winning production designer of Gladiator. So he was kind enough to come to the Frieze Museum at the invitation of the museum director to talk with us about the debt of the Gladiator team to Tadema, and it was a thrilling conversation, and he was incredibly kind and generous in speaking with the press as well. You see behind Arthur an example of what I'm talking about. That's one of his film stills. I think we can't finish without tipping the hat as well to Hubert Herkimer, the great Victorian artist. I agree with Ivo completely that if Tadema had lived another 10 years, he would have been making films. And the good news here is that his peer, another Royal Academician painter, did make films. Herkimer, quote, in his own words, sought to experiment in scenic art, in grouping figures, and in story making to express with real objects and real people the thoughts he placed ordinarily on canvas with brush and color. Well, Herkimer designed theater productions at his own home theater, and then in 1912, literally the year Tadema dies and 2 years before Herkimer himself dies, he and his son, who worked for Pathé, made films. And I think this is where the field needed to go, and indeed it did. I finish on a modern note. I've been following virtual reality, and they are so high on the Tadema-esque imagery. This is a recent release, an app that you can order called Rome, and it looks kind of familiar to me. Here we've got Tree's production of Julius Caesar, designed by Lawrence Alma-Tadema, and here we've got the app that you can get on your phone any day you want. So I think the joy of Tadema living on is rather wonderful. This is a final hurrah of the Colosseum as seen by app makers today in San Francisco, and Ridley Scott, of course, using that same imagery in the film, and then finally Tadema. We're going back now in time, and this connection in visual culture is very exciting to me because it means that this is an artist who transcends the bounds of his lifetime and still speaks to people in very urgent and compelling ways. Thank you for listening.
We can't let such a wonderful presentation go without opening up for discussion. I think we have a little bit of time, and then we can go downstairs and have a nice drink together. But I'm sure there are questions and comments for Peter. Shall let it all sink in. There we go, Barbara.
This question about Alma-Tadema's work rate has struck me in a lot of these talks. You know, the research that goes into the documentation of archaeology, etc. What about a studio assistant? Is he actually doing all this himself?
That is a great question, and I know bits and pieces. I would love to hear others in the room talk. I know the name John Collier. We just got an email about Bosworth, right? What's that fellow called? There was the whole long email about some... Fascinating. Stephanie, did you want to add?
I was just going to say that in the archive he had numerous drawings done by studio assistants, including his daughters. Some of their beautiful sketches of insects and all sorts of things are in there as well. But I just wanted to say the making of things was intriguing to Alma-Tadema, and many of his drawings are close-up details of hinges, the way nails were used, the exact way seats were put on things, and that lent itself very well to the process of theatre production.
Would you agree that he's an engineer manqué, that he's so interested in those details of logistics and how not just how things are made, but also the kind of gadgetry? And I think the automatons, the little toys, is really revealing that way. I mean, there might have been other grown men who played with them, but this was very clear that he was loving them and was happy playing with them, with children and so on. Yeah. That's it? Okay.
I was wondering, in the context of the really interesting discussions that have been going on about the merger of the past and the present in the paintings, in the studio, about how much evidence is there for the performance of plays or the dressing up of Tadema and his family in classical costume within their own studios, because that would sort of add another performative dimension to this kind of relationship with the past.
It's a great question. I was thrilled to find a reference, and I wish I had time to find even more. In 1893, Arthur Waugh writes an account of going to Laura's studio at Casa Tadema for an invitation-only performance of elite friends. The play is won by Laurence. She wrote plays, and it's a 17th century setting for her play, and it is performed by Laurence, her cousin, one of the Goss girls, and someone else. It wasn't Laura, it was someone, I don't have it fresh to mind, in that studio, that beautiful wood-paneled studio. And so everyone was there to admire this experience. The play was published and distributed around the world for others to perform, but that's exactly right, that this interaction of art and theater within the home makes perfect sense when you think about the Tademas going out to the theater to enjoy as patrons in the West End of London, but also putting on things in their home, in addition to the musical concerts that we know all about. There is this interest in drama. And I personally feel that one of the things to learn more about Laurence is exactly whether she went along to the new productions of her plays in European cities. If you follow her literature, these are premiered in very wide-ranging places like Scandinavia and Germany. So did she go, and did she bring her family? And were they maybe testing out the material in the home before they took it further outside the safety of their world? That's a really interesting place to dig. Thank you. Oh, sorry, we'll start with Ivo first. Yeah.
Okay, it's not about film.
Thank God.
What I wanted is you have the very stamps made after his paintings, and of course you have these very, well, let's say the stamps for art lovers, which are very refined, and we had them in the exhibition, many of them, especially in the Netherlands at the time. Yeah. But of course you had, of course, a lot of stamps in illustrated magazines as well, and these seem much more coarse, I'd say.
Yes.
So what are the limits then of the control of Tadema of that kind of reproduction?
It's a very good question. Let's be very precise here. The fine prints are distributed through the dealers, through a system. Obviously, they're shipping the supply, or some of the supply, to foreign agents, like in New York or South America, for sale there through these very controlled circumstances. You're absolutely right about the mainstream press. I showed you the Illustrated London News illustration, I think it was ILN, because that's exactly right, that is a low quality, cheap and cheerful, in the paper. Many people will throw it away with the paper when they're finished reading it. Others will keep it, tear it out, and put it on the wall or keep it somewhere in their home because they don't have the cash to buy a proper print made by Loewenstamm. So this is high, middle, and low, this distribution system. And I think that if I were Tadema, I'd be thrilled, because that's the highest kind of praise, to know that you are loved by all sorts of people. But of course, he's going to stay very focused on the money making at the high end. That's where big numbers are paid. Right, yes.
Intended to be kept, not
yes.
thrown away.
Yep.
And at Christmas,
yes.
as Charlotte just
graphic
said,
is certainly,
they're often in colour.
Yep.
And the graphic actually initiated one of the things they commissioned from Alma-Tadema. So the graphic themselves commissioned
yes.
Alma-Tadema's.
Absolutely.
And one of the series they initiated was the Shakespeare graphic series
yep.
in honour of Queen Victoria's 50th anniversary
right.
on the throne.
And that is illustrated in the book. Yep.
In a number of ways.
Yep.
It was reproduced as a photogravure,
yep.
a colour photogravure, a colour wood engraving, a black and white wood engraving, and they were signed by Alma-Tadema as well.
Right.
So it's more...
But
I do appreciate what you're saying, but it's...
Laura was in that group of 21.
Yeah.
That's right.
So,
that was a very specific project made explicitly for that.
Newspapers were themselves initiators
yes.
of the market.
If I'd had time, I would have gone there too. Absolutely. That's a great project.
Sorry.
We have a full-page illustration of Tadema's presentation.
I mean, even a fairly, sort of, something like that Illustrated London News
yep.
reproduction you saw, that would still have been under copyright, so Tadema
yes.
must have okayed that,
yes.
right?
Oh, absolutely. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Sure. Yeah. Scott.
Thank you. Just a couple of observations. Earlier on, people were talking about the luck or the lack of luck that Alma-Tadema was having with his house blowing up,
yeah.
and all these kind of things. And it put me in mind of Frank Lloyd Wright and the troubles that he had
yes.
with his house burning down and his family and everybody getting murdered. And then you showed an image of Frank Lloyd Wright with an Alma-Tadema print, which almost presaged what was going to happen to him. And then the other thing, which I thought was a weird coincidence, someone put up a Georges du Maurier image near the beginning.
Yeah.
I can't remember who, but Georges du Maurier, there was a story that he looked almost identical to Alma-Tadema, and people would go up to him and say, "Mr. Tadema, I saw your painting," and he started answering and go, "Oh, you've lost your Dutch accent." And they got very confused. And I just thought
it's magic.
It's just quite weird that there's lots of these little coincidences going on.
Indeed.
Which is not really relevant to today, but I thought I'd point
I would love to know if Wright met Tadema. I don't know. If anyone knows, tell me. Thank you. Thank you very much.